imagine what happens in many organizations. I like to share a story of where hitting the mark was probably missed, and in fact, what we could have done or what could have been done to really manage D&I a bit better. The example I'll give you might be known to most folks on this meeting today. Back in 2017, there was a major airline who actually had a full passenger list of a flight going from Chicago to Louisville. And the flight was packed and passengers were already in their seats. However, the management, at least in the terminal there of the airline, went inside the airplane and basically said, we would like to see who would like to be reaccommodated so that we could put other passengers on. Those other passengers were pilots and crew of another flight on the same airline that had some work to do the next day. Well, one individual by the name of Dr. David Dow was pulled from that flight, you may recall, a Vietnamese American, who, by the way, happened to be a doctor. And he was pulled by the airport security from that flight with no sort of support or, like, let's stop this action from members of that company's staff, that airline staff. Had a concussion, lost a couple of teeth, broke his jaw, and it was a horrible situation. So what happened? What was the message after that? So the chairman of that airline, and I'm not denigrating the airline. In fact, that airline is one of my airlines of choice. But the reaction to that was not the right action. It's where the company missed the mark. So the chairman actually announced in an internal memo. Now, we know internal memos don't stay internal for very long. He apologized for having to reaccommodate passengers, but did not apologize for the abuse that was inflicted upon Dr. David Dow. Now, with that said, passengers recorded that. They sent that all over the place through social media, and it became a target. It became an opportunity to ridicule a company that didn't manage that situation well. Now, how could that have been managed well? Well, the first thing I believe is that you acknowledge the mistake you made. We treated a passenger poorly. Now, what companies often say when that happens and the person happens to be one of color, well, we take diversity and inclusion very seriously. That incident had nothing to do with diversity and inclusion. So the message was mixed, sent mixed signals, and people are now trying to comprehend, well, what are you talking about? Instead of a straightforward apology, which was never given. And we do know, if we do our research, without me exposing the company, this chairman had some issues going forward where he was under his own challenges for staying in that leadership role. Why do I mention this? Because our backdrop today with COVID-19, which is one pandemic, and on top of that, the pandemic of racism, and most people would say, well, we saw the highlight of that during the George Floyd murder. We have to really put things in perspective as we look at how we communicate these issues. George Floyd's death had nothing to do with a lack of Black or Latinx or women or people of color in the Minneapolis Police Department. It had a lot to do with a rogue cop on a particular day, for whatever reasons, the complexities, the tensions of COVID and what was going on in our environment. And we don't know how COVID-19 has affected many people. He chose to act in a behavior that was just horrible. And we've all seen that situation on the news. So what happens as we look at diversity and inclusion, and how do we take it very seriously so that we don't hit the mark? And this does not mean that companies intentionally miss the mark, but oftentimes, again, because of Dr. Roosevelt Thomas's definition of complexities and tensions, we're just consumed with so much stuff. How did we manage this in the company I worked for, Johnson & Johnson? Well, first and foremost, the beauty of communications, and a lot of people are communications experts on this call today. We aligned, the Diversity and Inclusion Office aligned with communications people who understood the business imperatives. We aligned with business leaders who understood the market. We aligned with keen, diverse marketers who understood customer dynamics. And when you put all those things together, you can find business opportunities within your marketplace. And remember, I'm from a healthcare background where you can solve issues around healthcare disparities. You can look at ways in which some populations are affected by disease states differently than others. So how do we kind of focus our attention scientifically, medically, business-wise to address that? And when all those things are done right, then you actually hit the mark. And when you miss the mark, it's not because we don't take diversity and inclusion seriously. It's because we may have some things wrong with the engine that propels all this movement that's supposed to be adhering to these different kinds of situations.
Thank you, Anthony. So communication happens in the doing, right? The actions, our words, our actions, listening. Can you expand a little bit on the Minneapolis Police Department and maybe with the George Floyd situation, how they could have better communicated that commitment to diversity and inclusion prior to George Floyd?
So great question. One of the ways, and this is not to say the chief of police or the city of Minneapolis, I think the mayor has showed up very well in the situation and apologized for that kind of behavior. What we often find is that we're just not prepared to take on these situations that require pure honesty, directness, honest communications. And what does that basically mean? It basically means that we go doing our day-to-day work, and we find ourselves sometimes in situations where that's disrupted. And it's not that we are not prepared to deal with the disruption, but again, back to the complexities, let's call that COVID-19. Back to the complexities, let's call it racial injustice. Let's call it systemic racism. People align that with the police department, right? You can take all of these situations and say, okay, what is the manner in which I communicate the messages that clearly say, and here's the tough part, Keisha, that we don't have all the answers, but we're striving to be better at what we do every day called policing, right? And we also understand that that's not an indictment on the entire police department, but we have to do better in eradicating rogue police officers who, for some reason, and we can't judge that ourselves, but for some reasons they come to work that particular day or on a particular day where intentions are not just good. And I think we all respect the fact that police officers have a very difficult job to do, and they're balancing tension all the time. And you know what? As personal as it may sound to these officers, they want to get home. And they need to do what they need to do to get home. In the spirit of that, we can't leave them off the hook by not communicating and behaving in such a way where, we're responsible for making sure you get home safely as well by doing the right thing.
Thanks, Anthony. Dr. Cudjoe, Justin, do you want to add anything before I move on to the next question? I think you guys are muted.
I think another interesting thing after the George Floyd protests were happening, and what we saw on social media, and lots of brands making statements, lots of companies making statements of being allies in this, in the Black Lives Matter movement. I think like one of the things that has stood out to me as the months have gone on, and reading just, from Black designers and different communities outside of the normal design space or the design voices that our industry hears a lot, because design is like largely white. Black Lives Matter is not a design challenge, and like it's not my place to be like, oh, what I would do is I would make a poster to try to raise awareness for all this, and it's like it's not my place to do that. So like instead, like looking for opportunities to amplify organizations that, they're Black led, it's their community, they are the ones who are like living this every day, like trying to find ways to amplify that in a way that also just like doesn't add to my brand in like a weird, cynical way. So I think like those thoughts have been new to me this year, trying to figure out how to best participate and trying to be an activist that is positively contributing.
Absolutely.
I think just to jump off of what Justin was saying, it's always interesting when Black pain is attempted to be commodified. So that fear of particularly people taking the opportunity to turn it into almost a competition of how much they can evoke emotion through photos started to become very tedious on social media. As you would scroll through, you would see images that you're not sure what the intent was. Was the intent to bring awareness, or is the intent to evoke emotion? And, you know, there's a large history of commodifying Black pain. Black pain can be very enticing for some people to enjoy, right? So I really appreciate that perspective from Justin as well.
Thank you. So, Joseanne, my next question is for you. Breaking down communication barriers are difficult if we're not aware of our bias. After George Floyd, many people of color shared that violence was not only happening in the streets, but the harm was also occurring in the boardrooms and classrooms. As a recent PhD graduate student, so I should say Dr. Cudjoe, I'm sorry for saying Joseanne, I'm gonna respect the education there. That was a lot of work. And an educator. What are some of the ways you see unconscious bias playing out in the messaging and images in academic spaces? And what are some of the recommendations that you can provide?
I think I would start at the idea of unconscious bias. I think a lot of times unconscious bias kind of piggybacks with check your privilege. These things have become so much a part of the everyday conversation that we stop seeing them as just the first step. So unconscious bias is just the first step towards a whole process of change, right? So it's not just, I did this because it was unconscious bias. I did this maybe because it was unconscious bias, but what do I do next, right? And I think that's important to kind of start, you know, even answering this question, where understanding that unconscious bias is just the first step. And then I think about, you know, the ways in which words and images can be violent, right? They can create trauma in the same way a physical, something physical could create trauma. So understanding this is important for communicators to understand that you're not just creating media, you're creating something that can create trauma to the consumer if you say it in a particular way. I think one of the things that I always think about while I was a student was the use of deficit language. And I think, you know, that's a conversation that's been happening around academia for a while. Particularly, I worked with McNair scholars who are first generation underrepresented students who are attempting to go into PhD programs, right? So I worked with McNair for quite a while. And a lot of times the messaging around McNair is this question of, why are students of color failing? Right? And that would be the messaging. And you would see that messaging a lot of times in internal documents. And as we said earlier, these documents never really stay internal, right? So we see this messaging about why are they failing? Instead of seeing it as, how are students of color succeeding and what can we do to use the same platforms they've succeeded before and duplicate those programs or those platforms. And it may seem like a subtle change, a subtle word change or semantics, but at the end of the day, when we frame students of color as always failing, it says something to them, right? There's expectation, oh, they're going to fail anyway. They don't have the cultural competency or the educational background to actually do this work, versus changing the notion and changing the language around how do we provide the support for students who can succeed because they're here and they have shown themselves willing to succeed. What are we doing to support them? So that was something that I saw continuously within academic spaces. And I think the other thing that I thought of when I was thinking about how would I frame this conversation is conversations I had with other students of color, particularly in the grad school level. I remember having a conversation with one of my friends in her institution. In her department, she was one of maybe 2 students of color doing her PhD. And we would always smile and laugh at the idea that when it was picture day, and picture day, you know, if there's a new magazine coming out or a new website coming out, she would always receive emails like, you need to come to picture day. And inevitably she would be in the front of the pictures, right? And she would always struggle with that because she was actually in a space where she was thinking about leaving her institution, because she was struggling in her department. But yet she was the face of the department because she was a Black woman, because she was a Black woman who visually wore her religious beliefs, her garments showed who she was. She was always framed as the image. So I think a lot of times we need to think about not just using the marginalized communities as the icon or as the token image, but really understanding how do we engage with solving some of the cultural issues that they may be facing, because it's a mismatch to see yourself on a poster, being the image of come to my department, come here and study, when you're not being supported while you're there, right? And people know, like students know when it's not authentic. When you feel like I'm being used, I'm being a token at this moment, right? And you see that across the globe, right? Across many academic spaces, right? And I think it's something that needs to be rethought or rethink about. So for me, unconscious bias is just the first step. First step is saying, yes, there's unconscious bias. I may not be thinking about it this way, but I need to actually educate myself, right? And see, how do I do better? And sometimes it's depending on allies to kind of bounce things off of. But then there's also a responsibility for yourself to kind of do the educational work yourself, because the information is out there, right? But we have to put ourselves to the task of learning and relearning cultures and ideas that are different from our own.
So I'm happy that you brought that up, because I have a white colleague who is a professor who said to me, you know what really bothers me? Because she's very connected with the Black student community, and said, I'm really bothered when, I have folks come to me because they know of my relationships, and they'll say to me, hey, can you help me get a Black student for a panel, or help me get a Black student for a webinar or something like that. So it sounds like what you're saying is, communicating D&I is also in the doing, right? So how can academics in the doing highlight their commitment to D&I past their statement of, I'm committed to D&I?
I think it's not in the moment of when we're doing a webinar or when we're doing an activity where we need that Black student to sit there or that LGBTQ student to sit there to be the representation of. It's in the background moments, right? In the moments when you're building with these communities, when you're actually engaging with these communities and finding out, hey, what do you need, right? It's in those moments of, why are so many of you entering programs but not graduating, right? So when it comes to academia, right? So asking those questions that are not just about that moment of communication, right? Because it feels much more authentic when you allow students into these spaces. They feel more welcome and they can bring something else to your organization when they feel actually welcome and they feel that the communication is actually that they are wanted there, right? And it's not just come do this thing for me because we need your face on it, right?
Yeah. And I'm shifting away from our rules a little bit, but it's a great follow-up question from someone in the chat. Please remember to put it in the Q&A. But they're asking, how do you think Black and Brown doctoral students can support each other and create a community to help each other through the process?
Definitely. Great question. I think for me, my time at Rutgers was greatly helped by the fact that I was a part of a Black doctoral graduate student group, right? And we supported each other across disciplines, supported each other through theirs, showed up at each other's every presentation. That's what supported us, right? We found that community there. So I think it's about building community. Building community is always the way that I think people have been able to succeed in tense moments forever, right? That there's a history of building community, supporting each other. In my work, I do a lot of work around sister circles and the ways in which women of color form circles with people who are not even related to them to support each other through pain and through trauma and through happy moments as well. So for me, it's forming community. I think that's the only way to succeed sometimes in certain moments. Yeah.
Absolutely. And, there's a Rutgers alum, Dr. Shireen Lewis, who runs its sister mentors out of DC and essentially helps Black and Brown students and women who are in the doctoral space come together. She has these sessions that bring them together for weekends to do writing together, right? Because there's so many other messages in that space. We talked about a little bit about the use of the word Black, right? And that AP just decided that Black should be capitalized when you're speaking about a Black person, but how you struggled in writing, during your time as a student, because you would always capitalize Black, but you were told it's lowercase Black.
Definitely, yes. And I mean, we can go on and on about decolonizing the academic curriculum forever. But, that's part of the struggle too, right? When your work is not seen as valuable in certain spaces at times, it could be very traumatizing when you like, I have this great thing I want to write and people are like, no, that's not important. It can be traumatizing, yes.
Right, thank you. So Justin, moving to you from a design perspective, the news cycle has been filled with companies and individuals who have gotten themselves into trouble over the use of culturally incompetent images and messaging. During our prep conversation, you shared about some pieces that you were working on and just your process of analyzing its inclusiveness and just your journey of getting there. Can you share with the audience your story and some of the lessons you've learned, as well as best practices that you engage in, both as an ally and activist, to support belonging through images? So we'll pull up the presentation.
Yes, this was from 2012, which is a different time. Barack Obama was running for re-election. Facebook was still optimistic. It kind of felt good, like it was a place where people got connected. And startups were very big. And so this was a time when I was maybe two or so years into being like an independent designer and focused on like the types of projects that I wanted to be working on, like web design, graphic design, branding, all that stuff, and trying to use it in a way to build community, both my community where I live and then a larger just like set of like, I want to do design that represents sort of a mission and a focus and like bringing causes to realization. And so one of the startups I was working with was like an online digital town hall kind of thing where the focus was to get community engaged in problems and have people submit ideas. And it was a web app. So there's lots of stuff that goes into that in terms of the technology and the code and like what it does and the engagement metrics and the reports. And I was like the lead designer on the project. And diversity was something that we aspired to be. We knew we weren't, like, we didn't embody that. We were like a very white company, very male focused. Startups tend to be that, just like design. And so we knew that was like a lacking point just as the company existed. And so in my tasks of making visuals, making imagery to amplify the organization and the mission of that organization, there's lots of colors. There was orange and bright, and thinking about type and stuff. And it was in the process of making all of these things, like we made some avatars that were, in my mind, like, oh, look at it, we got good hair, fun, they're happy. Who doesn't love to get online and add their ideas? Very simple idea, simple view of that. And, it's like they were all white, and I think like it didn't even dawn on me that like in my mind, I'm just like, hey, I'm sticking to this 2-color palette, and we're gonna do blues and oranges and greens. And then one of the guys who was like head of like working in Kansas City and like some of our bigger clients that would be like in rooms with people like Black and brown leaders, like just a diverse set of people. He's like, hey man, these these icons are so white. Like it's like, you can tell people get like, are uncomfortable. They don't feel like it's like, this is like representative of like a diverse company. It's like, and I was like kind of shocked, and like, I feel like just oblivious at the time. I was like, what do you mean? Like, they're just colors. I was like, but they're not like speaking to like the core mission of the company. And so I totally like checked myself and was like, okay, I did, like, that's wrong. Like, we should fix that. And so on the next slide, it's like, you know, taking those like chunks of hours in a day and you got all this stuff to make. It's like, okay, well, we need to like actually make something that is more like representative of like the people that we want to be reaching and the people that we hope use our product and all of this stuff. And so we just changed, I was on that previous slide, we just changed, like we spent more time on making like age, race, gender, style, and just like put that more of an emphasis just from our design team. So it's not like we're just doing the bare minimum of like just churning out this app. It's like, we want to make sure that our design team is doing what's needed to kind of amplify this mission. And so I think like, you know, that lesson, that small little tale, like informs a lot of the projects. I mean, all the projects that I currently work on in terms of websites and organizations that we'll partner with. And so on the next slide is an example of a web project where, you know, just even simple things where it's like, okay, well, they're called the Union for Contemporary Art. They're in North Omaha, which is, Omaha is a very segregated city. North Omaha is a large Black population, underfunded, sort of left behind in a lot of the city visioning. And this nonprofit put down its roots there. It's led by a woman, Brigitte McQueen Shue, who's just amazing, has a big vision. And our goal in making this website was to be like, okay, well, sure, let's show art, and because they bring gallery shows to the community. It's like, well, yeah, we of course want to celebrate the art and the beautiful imagery, but we also want to celebrate the people that make it. They're very diverse artists. It's a good mixture of backgrounds and education, and not all of them are from Omaha. And so on the next slide too, it's like in the big sort of picture of making this website a realization, it's like you're concerned about budget and features and making sure it's accessible and responsive so that people on phones have a good experience. All the images have alt tags so people with screen readers can have access to it. And we're not only showing art, but you know, lots of kids in the community coming through there. So it's like we want to show really high quality imagery of people using the space, making sure that people know it's like, yes, this is for you. This is for your community. We want you to come in and get involved. And so I think like just trying to be mindful of a host of levels in the projects that we work on, and making sure that we're lining up everything, not only from like a functionality standpoint, an accessibility standpoint, but really taking the opportunities to highlight a lot of the good things. And in this case, like in a part of the city that has been neglected, and this is like a really positive force.
Thanks, Justin. So I'm going to ask a question that can really be for anyone on the panel. In this moment of racial reckoning, a lot of companies, organizations are coming up with these really bold diversity and inclusion statements, right? And talking about their commitment to diversity. Yet, when I look at their websites, I don't see that commitment to diversity, right? And I often say that diversity and inclusion is really in the doing, right? Especially when I look at their leadership table. There's a saying that if you're not sitting at the table, you're what's being served, right? In leadership, right? So when you look at their leadership, there's not a lot of diversity in their leadership. Or if there is diversity, there is one or two, which I call the token diversity people. How can organizations get into this space, realizing that diversity, inclusion, and equity is a journey, not a destination, but being able to communicate where they are in this moment and where they want to be?
I'd like to take a stab at that if I can. I would start with the premise that it's how, again, we define diversity and diversity management. We can have a room full of all white women and no one can argue that there's no diversity in that room. There's diversity of background and a whole 9 yards, all of the things you alluded to earlier, Keisha. Where we feel short is how we manage that team, right? And we also fall short in admitting where our deficits are. I heard Dr. Cudjoe talk a little bit earlier, and it came out in all of our conversations. When I worked in corporate America, which is the majority of my career, I was always sort of dazzled by when one senior leader of color left a position, we never filled that position with another senior leader of color. Most times we want to believe it's a missed opportunity. Sometimes it's intentional. So how do we balance that, right? How do we make leadership teams, companies aware that talent of color for the roles you're interviewing for don't necessarily come with a deficit? They come with assets that we fail to recognize because we're kind of unilateral in our intention to build capacity in our organization with folks who look the same. I see also how we look at unconscious bias, right? We have to understand in areas in which we work and the work that we do, there is also intentional bias, right? And both can create disruption because both allow for us to create some sort of action. So let's be reminded by the fact in these corporations, now today, as you see a lot of outpouring of care and dollars and hiring of folks, that's intentional. That is to be applauded and recognized. And some might say, well, it took you such a long time to do this, right? Well, we have to remember too, some companies were doing this before George Floyd, right? What we have to realize is we have to catch up. Now, do we have a lot of time? That's a question for the various organizations. So within these organizations, we're not perfect. There is no organization I know of, and I try to study a lot of these organizations, particularly around D&I, Keisha, that are not perfect, but some strive harder than others to make way or even repair damages that were done previously. And when they're conscious or how unconscious they are about biases are realized or exposed, it accelerates the progress in these companies to do more. And I think that when we look at companies today, let's applaud them, knowing that every company is not perfect, but let's also, many folks on this call today, let's help our companies accelerate momentum in the direction of creating solutions rather than celebrating the problems.
So I want to get to some of the questions. We have a lot of questions here, and I know we're probably not going to get to all of them. What I do want to share is that we will share our contact information after this webinar. We'll mail it to everyone, so you can feel free to continue the conversation because all of us here are dedicated to this work and support it. So one of the questions I have here is for organizations seeking to conduct an assessment of their communications portfolio with an eye for diversity, equity, and inclusion, where should we start and what are some tools that we can use?
Keisha, can you repeat the beginning of it?
Sure. For organizations seeking to conduct an assessment of their communications portfolio with an eye for diversity, equity, and inclusion, where should we start and what tools can we use? So I could actually start this conversation off for us. One of the things I would say is first look at the values of your organization, the mission of your organization, right? What are you saying? Who are you saying you are? What do you believe in? And then see how those values are playing out in all of your communication, right? When I say playing out, how is your communication embodying those values? Stop for a second, get a pulse assessment, right? Talk to your stakeholders, talk to your internal folks, your external folks, or the folks that you're trying to attract, right? What do they think about your communication? Do they see themselves in your communication, right? Is it resonating with them? I think what a lot of companies are not realizing is diversity as a value proposition or the business case for diversity. If you make that business case as part of your organization or it's part of your value proposition, the communication around diversity and inclusion is going to be easier and simple. And then also the act of just stepping back and thinking to yourself, do I see myself in this? Do I see others in this? So I shared with this group when we were talking that as a communicator with many marginalized identities, when I do a communication or I do a marketing piece or produce a video, I step back and I look at it, but I also share with others, right? I share with my white husband, right? Who has a different background than I have. Can he see himself in there? But I also share with others of different identities, right? Is it to somebody who is from another, I can't even think about it, but from a different identity, can they see themselves in it as well? And if they can't, and I need them to see themselves in that, then how do I shift it to make it different? I'll let you guys jump in.
Yeah, I think that AIGA is the Professional Association for Design, has a good resources set for in diversity, equity, and inclusion in their initiative. And they put on several workshops like in Omaha and just at a national scale. I know that it's become more of an emphasis, and the people who are on that panel bring a lot to the table. And I think they've got a good list of resources and impact reports. There is no like rubric that I've seen like people work from, but that is a good idea too. Someone mentioned that in the chat, but that's a resource that I will turn to for assistance and just how to navigate some of this stuff.
All right. So we have, Joseanne, did you want to add anything?
Fine, I think it'll come up later on as you go along. It's fine.
Okay. So there's actually a question for you, Joseanne. Dr. Cudjoe mentioned decolonizing. This is a big concept of which perhaps many are unaware of, the idea that US territories, Puerto Rico, Hawaii, Alaska, American Samoa, and southern US states are still somewhat exploited as a colony. Would appreciate hearing more about the decolonizing concept for the 21st century.
I think it's right in that it's a large concept. I think particularly in academia, it's understanding the ways to decolonize the curriculum itself. I think as a media professor, I think of my students as not just, oh, they're taking my class, but what they're going to do in the future, right? And they're going to be the future communicators for a lot of companies. And if they're not exposed to a canon of research and a canon of work that is not just coming from white males, their lens will be very, very one-sided. And I think when it comes to decolonizing the curriculum itself, it's introducing scholars of a host of different backgrounds and ideas into the canon, right? And by the canon, just meaning the core work and the core syllabus that students are reading from. And that's critically important, that universities no longer stick to only telling the great stories of white males, and understanding that other people have other views and lenses that may oppose or may go along with the canon, and allowing students to think critically as they engage with that work. For me personally, I make an emphasis to include a lot of women of color in all of my writing, particularly because I feel like there are times when we talk about issues of class, or we talk about issues of violence or police brutality, and we look at it from a top-down way, and we're not looking at the ways in which women of color or people of color or working class people are understanding these ideas. We only think of it from this idealistic point of view. So for me, decolonizing really focuses on the ways in which we introduce other voices into the curriculum, and the ways in which we're training students who are going out there to be the future communicators, that they have access and they understand this, different viewpoints. And that's really, really important. I think I've had students who left my course and would tell me, I'm glad that I read such and such person in your class because I never read her before. And that changed the ways in which I thought of XYZ, right? When we think of, a host of different ways in which universities tend to do so. Some universities are doing a great job of that. They're introducing courses within their core curriculum where everyone has to take. Other people are doing it in ways that are less intentional, that the course is there and if students want to take it, they can take it. But I think it's important to kind of introduce these kind of marginalized voices into the core curriculum in a much more intentional way, so that our future leaders are actually getting this information before they get into the workforce, and they're now scrambling to try to understand where the implicit bias is coming from, when university is the space where you should be doing that.
Does anyone want to add anything else on there? I also think, just to add on to that, decolonizing is also thinking about what we think of as normal, right? And realizing that it's coming from a white supremacist culture. So even showing up in the workplace, how we show up in terms of, there was this big thing in New Jersey passing a law about Black hair, right? And allowing for braids and for Black women to have afros in the workplace or their head wraps. That's part of the decolonizing in the workplace. So really stepping back and looking at your workplace culture. I can speak with an accent because I'm Trinidadian, right? But also, as many Black people would say, there's a lot of code switching that happens when we go into the workplace, right? Are you allowing your employees to feel comfortable that they don't have to code switch in the workplace by creating a culture that we all belong? So that's another way to think about decolonizing in the workplace. So I'm gonna have the final question. And again, if your questions weren't answered, we're going to provide our follow-up contact information for you to contact us to keep this conversation going. But what would be the next steps for organizations who have conducted diversity education for their employees? It often seems that once the education is done, there is no follow-up.
You actually hit the nail on the head by asking the question and then answering it. One of the things we find with training in general, that it's hitting the mark for a certain period of time, right? And when the training is done, whatever type of training it is, unconscious bias or you pick one, we tend to go on and live happily ever after, which does not exist when you're dealing with a topic like this. What I advocate for is, how often do we check in 2, 3, 6 months later as to what progress are we making towards the goal? How are the goals aligned with our business imperative? If we achieve these business imperatives, how do we look at D&I to marry into some solutions to how we do business better? I often think too, when we think of ways in which we can be better at this work, we fall into a trap. And that trap is when we see the negative impact of, and let's not call it diversity, let's call it racial injustice. We tend to indict a nation. We tend to believe that all folks who don't look like me, who happen to be white, are my enemies, right? I look at the data of the folks who are involved in this call today. And yes, the majority of the folks on this call are declaring themselves as white. And that, for me, is opportunistic for us, all of us, to look at ways in which we spread our word and our intentions to improving outcomes, right? As I said to you the other day, Keisha, data are stories with a soul, right? So what is the accountability that we have as individuals as a result of this meeting today to carry forth what we learned to folks who are not here, and then correct, not because people are wrong, but correct misconceptions, address complexities that we ultimately realize by doing this, we're in the fight together to solve all the things we've been talking about today.
So thank you so much, Anthony. Thank you, everyone. Teresa, if you could just throw up the last slide with the resources. We're right at the 1 o'clock hour. And we'll definitely be sharing some reference materials that we curated. And we'll also share that with you as well as a takeaway from this piece. Thank you so much to everyone. Dr. Cudjoe, Justin, do you have any last takeaways that you want to share?
I think the last thing that I would talk about is the question of what I do when I do make a mistake. And I think a lot of times we don't think about that, right? How do I respond to a mistake when I'm called out for doing something? My communication piece did not hit the mark. And I think Justin did a great job of explaining how he went back and rethought and rethink how he did it. But then also to the point of how do we write apologies? And I often say, do not, when you're apologizing for something like that, you do not Kanye West it, right? You do not center yourself in the apology and make it about, I'm sorry, center those who were actually inflicted into the center of your apology, and not how do I make myself feel less bad about this moment, right? And then being very open to learning. I think that's the thing about this topic. It's not something that you learn overnight. It's something that's continuous, that you have to continuously be open to learning new things, understanding new ways, hearing other perspectives. So I think that's very important.
Justin, do you have anything?
Yeah, I think my favorite projects that I've done are like really, like the team is very diverse and broad and, from all over. And like the idea of we're all in this together, I think like when that's sort of at the core of the projects and the work, like the work is better and like the process is better. And I've seen a lot of like learning in that process, in those processes where it's like, when it becomes like everybody's sort of discussing the meaning of an image, and is it traumatizing? It might be cool to some look, but like in another way it's bad. So it's like just being open and honest in that iterative approach of like design and message making and communication, I think goes a long way. And it kind of keeps everybody like just on the journey together, and the end result better.
Thank you so much again, everyone, for sharing your expertise with us today. I'm sorry we went over just a little bit. Dr. Cudjoe, you get a big shout out from Rutgers Sky. They're here and they're representing, they're saying hello, they're proud of you. So I'm going to turn it back over to Jamia. Thank you, everyone. And thank you for joining us. Thank you for taking this journey with us.
Thank you all so very much. Thank you, Keisha. Thank you to all of our amazing panelists. Thank you to all of our attendees who took the time out of your schedules to be with us today and learn about this really important topic. Again, a huge thank you to our wonderful D&I committee. This has been a great team effort. I always say teamwork makes the dream work. So we've done some amazing work. Thank you again to PRSA New Jersey, to our board and the leadership for your continued support. And we look forward to continuing these courageous conversations in 2021. So thank you all again for your time, whether you just attended this one or all of our webinars. We're just excited to have you all, grateful for each and every one of you. Encourage you to continue sharing, learning, attending these webinars and other events that we'll have in 2021. We will see you next year, and we wish you all a wonderful holiday season. Thank you and have a good one.
Bye.